بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وبعد. Inshallah, we'll continue on the topic that we started a long time ago about the Asraniya or Modernist movement. Alhamdulillah, last time we discussed the basic premises or the basic concepts underneath or underlying the movement itself. Well, those concepts or those premises, if you see or if you read someone who has been influenced by this movement, and he does not actually state those premises as I mentioned last time, and he does not actually state those things explicitly that we talked about last time, but you can see from his reasoning that in fact he believes in those premises that we critiqued last time. Earlier we mentioned that mistakes will come about through different ways. One is if the premise is wrong, as we talked about last time. Secondly, also if the methodology is incorrect. The methodology basically is how you move from point A to point B. For example, usul al-fiqh, for example, is really the methodology of fiqh, how to go from what are the evidences to the fiqh conclusions. Really, it is the methodology that the Asraniya movement uses, that really this is how they mislead people and fool people by it, and he's trying to show that they have a specific methodology, and thereby misleading the people to the wrong conclusion. But in fact, since they claim to be scientific, they claim to be using their aql and having a consistent approach. But in fact, if you study their methodology, they are very far actually from being aqlani at all. In most cases, their methodology is inconsistent, or in fact they have no basis or no proof for their way of thinking. Inshallah, today what I'm going to mention is some of the ways and means, or some of the methodology that some of these different people use to mislead some of the Muslims. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that everyone who belongs to this school uses these principles or uses these means, nor does it mean necessarily that anyone who might fall under these categories or use these kind of approaches is necessarily Qur'ani. How much time is it? 3 minutes? And I tried to make the introduction long enough to take it up to the time of the Adhan, because we're going to break. So the Adhan, but that's all I can say for the introduction. So let me move on to some of their ways, some of their methodology. And especially when it comes to hadith, as I mentioned earlier, that especially the topic of the Sunnah and hadith, this is an area in which they play around with the most. Sometimes many of them they insist that what we have to follow is the Qur'an, because it is authenticated from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and only authentic hadith. And for some of them, they have actually written that what they mean by authentic hadith, they mean something like 14 or 20 mutawatir hadith. And to them, the Qur'an and Sunnah is the Qur'an and 20 mutawatir hadith. Rather than they claim that we have to make sure that we follow only what is authentic from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And this would imply that they have some way of judging hadith. And if they say we should only follow what is authentic from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, this implies that they have some way of judging hadith. Either they judge hadith according to the opinions, in other words, according to the methodology of the scholars of hadith and muhaddithin, or they judge hadith in a different way. Well, they do not accept the way of the muhaddithin, and they reject the way of the muhaddithin, and they give many reasons for why they reject the way of the muhaddithin. And all of these reasons, these are claims that they make which are not true. يعني I don't want to go into this area in detail because actually this could take up the whole lecture. But they say, for example, that the muhaddithin, they just look at the isnad or the chain of the hadith, and they do not worry about the meaning of the hadith or the matan. Well, they make this claim saying this, therefore you'll find, for example, in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and others, and you'll find hadith with ridiculous meaning, but since the isnad looks good, the muhaddithin accepted it. Well, all of those who took the class in ulum al-hadith, we have a few here, inshallah they know that that's not true. If they got anything from the course, inshallah at least they got that much. And it is muhaddithin, and they studied not only the isnad, but they also studied the matan. And in order for a hadith to be acceptable for muhaddithin, and the matan or the text of the hadith has to be such that it cannot contradict the Qur'an, it cannot contradict strong resources, and there cannot be some kind of hidden defect in the hadith. Well, as I said, the most of the Asraniya writers, when you see them discussing hadith and discussing whether hadith is authentic or not, and they do not follow the conclusions of the scholars of hadith. But at the same time, none of them have ever come up with a new methodology, a new way of testing hadith, a new way of judging hadith. In general, basically, they just judge hadith based on their aql, and what sounds good to them they accept, and what doesn't sound good to them they reject. Well, I think I gave an example of that in the second lecture about in one of Jamāl Barawi's lecture, and this is similar to the argument of Muhammad al-Ghazali concerning the hadith of Prophet that people will not prosper if their affairs are in the hands of a woman, or if they are ruled by a woman. And both al-Ghazali and Jamāl Barawi, they approach this hadith from a completely aqli point of view. Well, not in the case of Jamāl Barawi. As I mentioned, I think in the second lecture, Jamāl Barawi says about Abu Bakr, the Sahabi, that he said, according to the scholars of hadith, he is not acceptable as a narrator of hadith. Well, this statement is a very strong statement, and in fact it is it is a mistake for sure, it is not true whatsoever. And I looked for Abu Bakr in many of the books of hadith, and here is the Sahaba, which the Muhaddithin consider all of the Sahaba are adul, and every one of them is adul. Well, also none of the scholars of hadith happen to say that about Abu Bakr. But that is beside the point. The point I'm getting to is how he judges that hadith and on what basis he judges that hadith. He judges that hadith purely on the fact that according to him there have been rulers such as Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir, whose people prospered. So therefore he's saying that in my view there are women who led people and the people prospered, so therefore the hadith must not be authentic. So he said, and we have two mashallah clock watches here just waiting for they believe in Hasad and Niyat. 1 second after the time it says they will make the adhan. And as I said, let me just finish this point before they stand up, is that he's judging it based simply on his aql, and saying that in my opinion I see something that contradicts this hadith, and therefore he rejects this hadith. We can discuss this point in greater detail. What is the definition of falah from an Islamic point of view? As I think I mentioned in the second lecture, it is not just an increase in GNP or something like that, but it is it implies both falah in this dunya wal akhirah. Well, to say to reject the hadith which is Sahih in Sahih Bukhari on the basis of what you've seen from Golda Meir and Margaret Thatcher, and to claim that their people had falah under them, this is really the way of thinking of al-Aqlaniyah. They take some example, and to them that example looks good, and therefore they judge the hadith on the basis of that example. I think now inshallah is the time for and the point that I'm trying to make here is that they claim, as I said, this is one of the ways that they mislead people by their methodology, by their arguments, and they claim that we only have to follow what is authentic from the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But then what they mean by authentic is not what the scholars of hadith, the muhaddithin throughout all of the years have said, but instead to them what is authentic is what meets their opinion or what sounds good to them. So probably one of the most extreme in this way of looking at hadith was Fadl Rahman, who was teaching at the University of Chicago for many years. And he said clearly about hadith, he accepted the arguments of the Mustashriqeen that most of the hadith are not authentic, for many reasons he claims. But he said that doesn't mean that we should reject them all. He says clearly, if the meaning is something good, we should accept it and take it as a hadith, regardless of whether it is authentic or not. And if we don't like the meaning, and if we find that the meaning is not good, we just reject it. And that is, this person claims to be, he's one of the few people who really, he calls himself a modernist. And he said that Islam needs to be modernized, and this is his modernization of hadith. Now at the same time, although they claim that this is their methodology, that we only have to use authentic hadith, especially hadith that deal with actual practices and sunnah, for example, with respect to adab, with respect to manners and so forth. And if they don't like these hadith at all, they don't like hadith which have specific meanings to them. They prefer the hadith which have, for example, general principles, like إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. This is the kind of hadith that they will accept. And as I said, some of them, they write very clearly that the hadith that we accept the Qur'an, and we accept very few of the hadith that are actually authentic, and some of them even reduce them to like 14 or 20 mutawatir hadith. Well, at the same time, one thing very interesting that we see in their approach, and again you find this in almost all of their approach, all of their writings, and it might be Allah Alam, because they are not actually specialists in hadith. But although they make this claim that we only have to follow what is authentic in hadith, at the same time they use weak hadith whenever it is helpful to them. And at the same time they make all of these claims that we have to follow only what is authentic. And when it seems convenient to them, or when something supports their argument, then they will use weak hadith. For example, here in this mosque we heard someone give a lecture, someone who liked democracy a lot. So to support his idea that everyone should get a vote in the election of someone, in the election of Khalifa or whatever, and he's trying to argue that men and women are equal and so forth, and everyone in society should be allowed to vote. And so he quoted the story of, if I remember correctly, it was Abdurrahman bin Auf. And during the time that Uthman was selected as Khalifa, and the story goes that Abdurrahman bin Auf knocked on everyone's door in Medina, asking, and he goes to men and women, who do they think should be selected as Khalifa? And based on his findings, and he chose that person, or he voted for that person as Khalifa. Well, as I said, this argument comes from the same person, from one of the same person who said that we have to be careful only to use authentic hadith, which is true. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But the point is that when weak hadith are useful for them, such as this incident of Abdurrahman bin Auf, this is not the true story. But when it's useful for them, they will use it to support their madhab. Perhaps also just as common, if not more common, with respect to the position of women in Islam, and the Sunnah, as I mentioned, and also the position of women in Islam. These are two of the areas that they try to discuss the most and try to bring about changes the most. With respect to women in Islam, and these same people who argue that we should only use authentic hadith, they almost always quote two stories from the time of Umar in support of their view that women should play an active role in politics and so forth. One is the story of when Umar ibn Khattab was on the minbar, and he advised the people about the mahr and tried to restrict the amount of mahr that is to be given. Whereas the woman came to him and said, how can you do that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an that even if you gave them a large amount of gold, you should not take it back from them. And so Umar said that the woman is correct and Umar is mistaken. Yani they use this, again, the same people who say we should always use authentic hadith, they use this story over and over again to prove the position of women, and that they should have, that they are, even during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, they felt free to go up to the Khalifa and so forth and so on. This might be true, but this story isn't true. And you cannot use this story, which is not true, as a proof, especially when they say that we have to be careful only to use what is authentic. Also from the time of Umar, they use the story of, and I always mispronounce the woman's name, so Allah to help me, Shafa. And they always use the story that Shafa was appointed by Umar as one of the hisba, one of the people who goes in the market and makes sure that there's no cheating in the market, and make sure that people use the weight correctly, and there's no munkar going on in the market, and they enforce what is ma'ruf. Again, this story coming from the same people who say we should be careful in hadith and use only what is authentic. And again, their definition of authentic is something that they never define. But they use this story again, which is not authentic. They use it to prove that women can be in the government and so forth. But the evidence for that is not authentic. Now, I'm not talking about the point itself, about what, for example, is the woman's role and so forth. That's not my point here. My point is that they are the same people who say we should be careful in using hadith and judge it in the light of modern times and so forth, and reject hadith that the muhaddithin throughout all the years have said are authentic. And these same people turn around, and when it's convenient for them, or in other words, when it supports their madhab, they are very quick to use weak hadith and to use weak stories to prove their point of view. This shows an inconsistency, of course, in their madhab, and sometimes it even makes you doubt their intention. When they say something clearly, that we should be careful not only accept authentic hadith, and then they go at the same time and using hadith which are not authentic, or stories which are not authentic, to support what they're trying to prove. And it just makes you question even where really the person what he's trying to do, and what's his goals in reality. And another approach that they use, many of them, and this is also a very dangerous and tricky approach, because by doing this you can come to a place and you can give a lecture to people with completely different views, and all of them, and you leave them all of them with the impression that what you said is correct, although what you meant actually may be completely incorrect. And this is the practice of using terms and using vague terms without actually defining them, and without actually defining them from Islamic point of view. And as Ibn Taymiyyah one time wrote about concerning the attributes of Allah of Sifat, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ and after the time of the Sahaba and Tabi'een, people begin to use terms for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Sifat for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which are not actually found in the Qur'an or Sunnah. And they discuss whether or not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has these characteristics. Well, as Ibn Taymiyyah pointed out, in order to say that this statement is correct or not, the person actually has to define exactly what does he mean by this statement. Well, if he leaves it vague, he's not saying anything, and he's allowing the people themselves to determine what they want to say or what they want to think is correct. For example, the three famous terms of democracy and freedom and equality. Besides the fact that two of these, of course, are the slogans of the Masons. The question is, when a speaker comes, or when any speaker speaks, an Islamic speaker uses these terms, the question he has to answer himself, and the question and the answer that he has to give to the people is, what does he mean by these terms? And if he's talking about democracy and he just leaves it open like that, without defining what does he mean by democracy, actually democracy, as from a Western point of view, and this is where it was developed, and this is where the concept comes from, although Muhammad Qaddafi claims it's Arabic and it comes from Dima Kursi. And democracy actually is a Western concept. Well, if you're going to use the word democracy, if you mean by it the Western concept, this is kufr. And because the Western concept of democracy, al-hakamiyya, or the one who has the right to lay down legislation, is the people, the Sha'b. And if this is what you mean by democracy, and this is kufr. So when you say that Islam is democratic, and you say, actually some people, they go to really an extreme here, and they say that the shura was the term during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and democracy is the term now. And I've seen many books saying that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ it was called shura, or consultation, and today it's the same thing as democracy. Well, when you use these terms, the one who, you're playing a game, because the one who knows that these terms are wrong, he will say, inshallah, this isn't what he meant by it. Well, the one who doesn't know that this term is wrong, he'll say, yes, Islam stands for democracy. Didn't you hear Sheikh so talk about it? And he will think it means democracy. So you have to be very careful to define it exactly. And if they use vague terms and they leave it open without saying exactly what they mean about democracy or freedom, and if freedom from the Western point of view, and when the movement for freedom actually began, it was actually freedom from the laws of the church. And what they meant by freedom originally in Europe is freedom from obeying the laws of God. And when you say freedom in Islam, this is not what you mean. But at the same time, you have to explain explicitly what you mean. Equality is the same. In Islam, is there equality between men and women in the same way that they try to make equality between men and women here in the United States? Is there equality between al-Muslimin wa Ahl al-Dhimma in Islamic State? And you have to define what you say. Or another term which I'm sure many people don't know what it means, but it is used by many of these, is fiqh al-musalih wal fiqh al-mufasid. One of them here, he gave a lecture and he used this phrase maybe 10 or 15 times. And he's saying that we have to judge everything within the concept of fiqh al-musalih and fiqh al-mufasid. The fiqh of what is beneficial for the people and what is harmful for the people. Now obviously Islamic law lays down definitions of what kind of maslahah we can accept and what kind of maslahah the Sharia doesn't accept. And we have to be more specific, especially if we're talking to people who do not have a background in usul al-fiqh or fiqh. Because if we're talking to people who do not have that kind of background, then when they leave the talk or read a book and they look at something which they think there's some maslahah to it, even if that's the type of maslahah that Islam does not consider or reject, they will argue for it and say based on this person's writing and so forth. Well, also another phrase, well, that's sufficient for that. That's one of the approaches of this school, and why many people are divided about it, because when you use these, obviously, when you use these terms, we could look at it and say, well, the brother meant such and such. And if we have good and husn al-dhan for the person, we'll say, oh, when he said democracy, he said such and such. When he said freedom, he meant such and such, and when he said equality, he meant such and such, and so forth. Lakin, this is not actually what he said. You are assuming something for the person, which is not what he actually said. What is good, to have this good suspicion about your brother, but sometimes, the proof or the reality of the situation is the opposite. And it is his mistake, if he does not define the term properly, and if he's trying to use this approach. Well, another way of this madhab, or this movement, I guess, is that when they discuss a topic, they do not present all of the information that is available on the topic. And when they discuss the topic, for example, they do not present everything that can be found in the Qur'an about that topic. Or they do not present everything found in the hadith about that topic. And they simply present that information that will support their way of thinking. And they leave out that which goes against their way of thinking. For example, in the Minaret magazine, the one I showed, I guess in the second lecture, I brought the copy of the Minaret magazine, I showed some pictures from that magazine. And one of the person who answers questions for them, his name is Paul Jordan, and he was asked about al-ayn. And someone wrote, and as I said, by the way, it's a characteristic of the modernist movement, that anything that we can't witness, anything that we cannot test and actually physically see, and they have a tendency to reject it. Well, ayn is one of those things that they reject. They do not believe, in general, the modernists, the people who belong to the school in general, going back to the time of Muhammad Abdu Sayyid Ahmed Khan, and they do not believe in things which are unseen. And one of the things that they do not believe in is al-ayn. Well, this person was asked a question. Someone wrote a letter to the magazine. He asked a question about al-ayn. I heard many Muslims from overseas mentioning this topic and believing in this and so forth. And I find this belief unacceptable. Al-ayn? The evil eye? Yeah, the evil eye is like democracy. The West has their own idea of evil eye, which is not necessarily the same as the Islamic, but that would be the closest way of translating it, the evil eye. Well, this person, Paul Jordan, in his answer, and he didn't present any hadith, he didn't present anything from the Qur'an. He simply wrote that the belief in the evil eye has been common among many cultures, and one of those cultures was the Muslim culture, and it is not necessary for us to believe in something which is simply cultural. And had he presented all the hadith, had he presented the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and perhaps said that these hadith aren't true, or that he gave some explanation for the hadith, this would have been not maybe perhaps not acceptable, but much better than what he did. And this is one of the ways that they avoid getting into arguments or getting into opinions that they don't approve of, simply by not mentioning it. And they don't mention all of the proof. And so therefore they are free not to, they don't have to bother with what the Prophet ﷺ said. They just don't mention it. Well, from a scientific point of view, of course, this is not correct. And if you want to study any topic, you have to study all of the data that you can find about the topic, and you have to weigh what is correct from that data. And based on that data, you make your conclusion. And not the other way around. Have your conclusion and reject the data, although this is a good trick among economists. As economists say, if you beat the data hard enough, it will tell you what you want it to say. But of course, the person who is looking for the truth, he will approach the topic in the opposite manner. The Muslim is looking to the Imam, Yeah? That's one thing nice about these lectures. We have lots of breaks in these lectures. And with respect to the point I was just mentioning about not presenting all of the information on the topic, and obviously what I was referring to in that case is, for example, this man did not mention the hadith about the ayn which are authentic, and some of them, for example, can be found in Sahih Bukhari, in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that the ayn is something true. Well, and we find that even if they present all of the nusus related to a specific topic, and even then sometimes if they, some of them, wish to avoid the actual meaning of the text, then what they do is they force their interpretation upon the text. When we talked about the history of the development of the Asmaniya movement, and we talked about the Mu'tazila, this was one of their approaches, especially of course with respect to the Qur'an, because they cannot deny any verse in the Qur'an like they can, or like they try to deny hadith. So therefore, with respect to Qur'an, and when the Qur'an goes against what they want to believe or what they want to state, then they force their interpretation upon the Qur'an. And an example of that we saw in the first lecture with respect to Muhammad Abdu, for example, when he said that the jinn are the modern day microbes, and because he didn't, as I said earlier, and he doesn't believe in the things of the unseen, ghaib, so he gives that interpretation for the jinn. Another example which is related to hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that we gave, I think in the second lecture, is the case of the Qutb Siddiqi claiming that the women should pray in the mosque. And when he discussed the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that said that it's best for a woman to pray in her house, and it's even better for her to pray in the private room of her house. We mentioned earlier that he said the reason the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that to that woman is because she did not have the proper clothing to go outside. And so therefore the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was telling that woman in particular that it is best for her to pray in her house. Well, basically it's very clear that he's forcing his own interpretation upon the hadith. The hadith doesn't say that whatsoever, and there's no evidence for what he is saying. Well, he himself does not present any evidence for that interpretation of that particular hadith. So even if they do present the nusus, they try to interpret the nusus in such a way that they basically force their own interpretation on the nusus. This is, as I said, this is if they do actually present all the nusus or all the texts related to it. Then when they get to the point that they present the nusus and they try to interpret in their own way, and they have difficulty doing that, then the third outlet that they use in their methodology is to say that al-aql takes precedence over naql, that human intellect takes precedence over what has been narrated from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So therefore, if there's any contradiction between al-aql and naql, between what we as human beings, what our intellect believes is true, and any contradiction between that and what is stated in the Qur'an or what is stated in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they say al-aql takes precedence, and either the naql, what has been reported, has to be rejected as untrue in the case of hadith, or it has to be, you have to make ta'wil for it, to give it some meaning consistent with what we believe is true. And as I mentioned, early this year, Muhammad al-Ghazali clearly stated that in Sayyidati. Well, many people are under this impression. And in fact, this impression comes from one of the sources for this impression, which is something I heard from many people after I became Muslim, is that Islam is a completely rational religion. And Islam is completely rational. You will not find anything in Islam that goes against rational thinking. And then as I said, when I first became Muslim, I heard this from many people. This statement. Well, many brothers say it, not realizing exactly what they're saying. Because if you say that Islam is a rational religion, if you mean by that that science and everything in this world came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the Qur'an and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ also came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore you're not going to find any contradiction between the two, and there's nothing wrong then with that statement. But if you mean by that in Islam we study everything, including the text and including the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in a rational way, and what we don't think is correct according to our intellect we reject, this is something else. And this is completely unacceptable. But those people who say that the aql takes precedence over naql, they never offer actually any strong proof for that opinion. Usually they state it as something well known and something given. And that the aql takes precedence over naql. Well, inshallah, in a later lecture, when we compare the Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jamā'ah to the Modernist movement, we'll discuss this question in more detail, the position of al-aql with respect to what has been narrated from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, either talking about the Qur'an or talking about his hadith. Well, the next step, besides saying that the aql takes precedence, another way of avoiding what the text actually say, another way of avoiding actually implementing what the Qur'an or what the hadith says, is to say that, as Muslims, we are supposed to take the spirit of the religion and not be too much worried about the detailed laws. Well, this concept also, I have read it in many books, I've heard it from many writers, that we are more concerned about the spirit of the religion and not as concerned with the specific law. Well, this most likely, Allah Alam, this probably, it's very possible some of the Muslims have been influenced throughout history by the Christians on this point, because the Christians completely take the spirit of Christianity and leave all the laws behind. This is something well known in the Modernist movement in Christianity, and Allah Alam, it may have influenced also the Muslim Modernists. And if you look to the Qur'an and if you look to the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it is very clear that we are supposed to take both the spirit and the detailed laws into consideration. Not just concern ourselves with respect to the spirit of the law. As in, even in the verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that piety is not facing the east or west, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues that verse by telling us that piety is believing in such and such, and also establishing the salat and paying the zakat and so forth. These are detailed aspects that we cannot ignore. One of the examples where they use this qaida, you could call it, or principle, as we take the spirit of the law, is with respect to hijab. What is the Muslim woman supposed to wear? They would say, many of them have argued, and unfortunately I said many of them, and I meant many of them, because I'm not talking about one or two authors here, I'm talking about the large number of authors. They argue that the Qur'an basically is telling us that the woman should dress modestly, and we shouldn't concern ourselves too much with the details of that dress. And what is the meaning, for example, of al-jilbab, what is the meaning of khimar, and so forth. And they're saying that this is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. This is not the meaning of these verses in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is simply telling us that the women are supposed to be dressed in a modest way. And this is based on this principle that we take the spirit of the laws and we don't worry too much about the details of the laws. Another aspect of their methodology, which when interpreting such texts, and this actually was related to what we talked about last time, so I'll not talk about it in detail today. And that is, sometimes they claim things as scientific fact, when in fact they are not scientific facts. And they judge, since they said aql takes precedence over naql, they judge the Qur'an and Hadith in the light of these so-called scientific facts, which are not scientific facts. As I said last time, I discussed this in detail last time, so I will not go over it again today. Well, another aspect of their methodology is that they have a tendency to quote some of the fuqaha and some of the leading scholars of Islam, quoting a statement which is true, but what they mean by that is something else. They do not mean the same thing that the scholars who originally made those statements meant. And perhaps one of the classic examples of that is the statement that the door to ijtihad is open, and that the door to ijtihad is never closed. There's no such thing as we can no longer make ijtihad anymore today. Well, this statement, as we know, the scholars of Islam, what you could call maybe the muhaqqiqeen, should be no. And they all accept this statement. There's no question that the door to ijtihad is open, and Allah Alam, it will be always open until the day of judgment. But the point is, what do you mean by that statement? Do you mean by that statement that the door to ijtihad or ijtihad is open to anyone? Do you mean by that statement that ijtihad is open on any question? Some of these modernists, they claim that in the early years of Islam, anyone was allowed to make ijtihad. And it wasn't until Imam al-Shafi'i came and wrote a-Risala, in which the qualifications for making ijtihad were narrow, and only specific people were allowed to make ijtihad. We'll discuss this statement also in more detail. This is not true, obviously. And even before the time of Imam Shafi'i, the scholars were careful about who would be allowed, or who should make ijtihad and who should not make ijtihad. But their point is that the door to ijtihad is open, and anyone should be allowed to make ijtihad. Whether he is a scholar, he knows about fiqh or usul fiqh or hadith or tafsir or whatever, this is not important. They are claiming that anyone should be allowed to make ijtihad, and many times they make that statement clearly without any doubt about it, while other times they kind of try to couch it in other terms. Well, perhaps when we discuss that point in more detail, I will bring some quotes from some of these authors. I have them here somewhere, but it will be maybe the event or project by the time I find it. Also related to this point is, on what questions do you make ijtihad? When you say the door to ijtihad is open, does that imply that even if there is a nusus, if there's some text, some Qur'an verse or some hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ on a specific point, that we can still make ijtihad? Some of them may not say that explicitly, but in their writings you can see that. One of the classic examples of that, which has just been repeated in the recent issue of Sayyidati, is with respect to, for example, the talaq, and who has the right to make talaq, and whether talaq should be just in the hand of the judge and taken out of the hand of the husband. And polygamy, or actually polygyny, and a man marrying more than one woman, and which is clear something mubah from the Qur'an, as Abu Saud can tell you. Some people are avoiding, and as I said, the most recent case I've seen was in Sayyidati. Is that the most recent issue? Sayyidati. This is my expert on Sayyidati magazine. And in the most recent issue of Sayyidati magazine, again, the same argument was made in a conference someplace on the position of women in Islam, that we should restrict the right of talaq, and we should restrict the practice of polygamy. This is exactly this kind of methodology which says that we may make ijtihad, that the door to ijtihad is open, and we may even make ijtihad on questions that the Qur'an, that there are clear nusus, clear text from the Qur'an about. Another statement similar to that, and this statement is kind of funny because the one that they usually refer to in quoting this statement, they usually refer to Ibn al-Qayyim in his book Alam al-Muwaqqi'in. And in this book Ibn al-Qayyim, he states that the fatwa, or a fatwa, is supposed to change with time and place, and if the conditions change, the fatwa changes. And he writes on this point for, I think, about 6 pages or so, at least, or actually more than 6 pages. Well, I think many of these modernists, they just take this point from someone else and they never actually read Ibn al-Qayyim's book. They argue that Ibn al-Qayyim said that the fatwa has to change with time and place. And they quote a long passage from Ibn al-Qayyim in which he said that. So the problem is that this statement is true. There's no question that fatwa changes with time and place. But what kind of fatwa are we talking about? Again, these people take it to apply to almost anything. That what was correct during the time of the Prophet or during the time of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een and so forth, things have changed now, and so therefore the fatwa has to change. And they change it, and not only with respect to things related to custom, but also with respect to al-Nusul. With respect to al-Nusul. As some of them clearly stated, we don't want just ijtihad in al-Furura, we want it in al-Usul. They are stating it clearly. Now they read Ibn al-Qayyim's passage completely, and not just quoted one portion of it. Ibn al-Qayyim makes it very clear that when he's saying that the fatwa has to change with time and place, he's not talking about things which are confirmed by the Qur'an and Sunnah. He's talking about fatwa which are based simply on the custom of a people. For example, if the custom of a people with respect to business dealings, if it's the custom of a people that if they make a certain statement, that means the business dealing is concluded and they both accept the business dealing, then the fatwa should be that if that statement is made, then that business dealing is concluded. But if this is a fatwa based again on the culture, on the time and the place, not based on nusus, not based on Quran or Hadith that says if you make this statement, the business dealing is concluded. So if things change over time and this statement loses its meaning and doesn't mean anymore that the business dealing is concluded, then the fatwa has to change. Then now if you make that same statement, it doesn't mean that the business dealing is concluded. So what Ibn al-Qayyim was talking about, and what he stated explicitly, if you continue to read what he said, is he is talking about fatwa which are based on custom, which are not based on nusus. These things have to change over time according to the conditions of the people and the environment of the people. But unfortunately, as I said, they take this statement and they quote the first 2 paragraphs or so of what he said, and they apply it to everything. And they apply it, as I said, they apply it to talaq, they apply it to hijab, they apply it to polygyny, they apply it even to the rules related to the Khalifa and so forth. This is one of their approaches, unfortunately. They do actually take statements and they quote well-known, famous ulama who made these statements, but then they give it their own interpretation, which goes against, especially in the case of Ibn al-Qayyim, goes clearly against what Ibn al-Qayyim was saying and what Ibn al-Qayyim meant by that statement. Along with this, also another approach that we see from this school or the people who have been influenced by this school. I throw that phrase in there to please Rahman. But he's not listening anyway, so and one of the characteristics that we see is that they have a tendency to fit and to follow, in Arabic you would call them shadh and munkar opinions, and strange opinions and opinions that have been rejected by the majority of the ulama, have been clearly rejected because of nusus, because of texts which go against them. They take these opinions and they try to revive these old opinions because they are consistent with their madhab and their way. And so therefore they try to claim that this is not my opinion, but this is what, for example, Ibn Hazm said or someone said in the past. Well, one of the early scholars of Islam, I believe it was Imam Ahmad, but I'm not sure. Maybe someone can correct me. He said if you follow the mistakes of the ulama, you will be fast. If you follow the mistakes of the ulama, you will be bad. Because, for example, the scholars of Kufa, when it comes to Nabi, which is actually a type of alcoholic drink, they said it is halal. While the scholars of Mecca, when it comes to some kind of riba, they said it is halal. The scholars of Medina, when it came to, I think it was singing, they said it was halal. Singing. Thank you. Who else? What else? Since you Iraq is Nabi. Well, the point is, if you follow the mistakes if you just look for different scholars and you follow their mistakes and claim this is the opinion of that scholar and so forth, then you'll be drinking Nabi, which is a type of wine, and you'll be singing at the same time and taking riba and you'll end up fasting. You follow all of these mistakes, which are, as I said, they are shadh, they are strange opinions, or they are munkar opinions rejected because actually they go against the Qur'an and Sunnah. But even the people of these schools, such as Imam Malik of the Medina school, he also rejects the idea of singing. And even their later scholars also said that this was the mistake of our earlier scholars. But these... No. And it will be actually from the Zandaqa. Fasik is much easier to say. And in other words, you will leave Islam. How about that? And if you read the writings of many of these people, again, they're trying to open the door to all sorts of different opinions, saying that we should open the door to these opinions and see which opinion is most suitable to us today. And as I've talked about many times before, the principle, if you're going to follow any fiqh opinion, the principle that you have to follow is you follow the fiqh opinion which you find is true. You don't follow the fiqh opinion which you find is the easiest. And we are obliged as Muslims to follow the truth, and we are not obliged just to follow what is easy. So they open the door for these kinds of opinions, such as Ibn Hazm's famous writing about singing. Muhammad Ghazali quotes him in length in his book about Sunnah. And of course, if they were to follow Ibn Hazm in everything, then maybe we could say, okay, follow Ibn Hazm in everything. But what they're doing is they're just picking his opinions that they like, and they say, this is the great Sheikh Ibn Hazm, and he said this, while, as I said, especially with respect to singing, his ruling on this, because he rejects the hadith from Sahih Bukhari, which is well known to be authentic. The other scholars have stated that this is not an authentic or not the correct opinion. But they try, as I said, they try to open this door with respect to maslahah, for example. They go to Tufi's writing. Tufi was a scholar who lived during the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, close to the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he wrote a very interesting work about maslahah, in which he said maslahah takes precedence to anything else. Nusus, doesn't matter. Maslahah takes precedence to everything else. So the scholars of Islam since this time have refuted his views. And in fact, his views really have been lost, and many people didn't even know about this strange writing that he had. Until recently, of course, it's been revived. Because this exactly is very convenient for the modernist school to say that maslahah takes precedence to anything. So if you find that the Qur'an says something is haram, but it's good for the people, you decide that it's good for the people, therefore maslaha takes precedence, and that thing becomes halal, it's no longer haram. And one of the ways that they try to open the door for all of these different opinions is that they bring hadith which are not authentic, such as the hadith that says that the differences in my ummah is rahmah, is a mercy, اختلافهم في رحمة. Or they reject other authentic hadith, such as Yusuf al-Qadawi, when he wrote about the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it says that this ummah will break up into 73 groups. All of them are in the hellfire except one, the one that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions are following. And he tries to reject this hadith in the same series of articles, basically where he's saying that we should be open to more difference of opinion, and we should accept other people's opinions and not be strictly following necessarily what we find in the Qur'an hadith and leave the door open. And in this hadith he has to reject it because this hadith is stating that actually there's only one Islam and all the other ways are in the hellfire. Well, his reasons for refuting this hadith, I'll not go into it, but in fact they are not strong arguments whatsoever that he presents for refuting this hadith. And again, I have his arguments someplace here. We won't bother with them right now. So finally, we can see that sometimes the only title I could give for this last category, it's not a nice title, but it's the only title I could think of, is sometimes they follow their hawa or their desire. Sometimes it is clear that this is what they're doing. And if they don't bring, on certain points, they don't bring any dalil, any evidence from the Qur'an Sunnah, but they simply make a statement that shows that on this point basically they are basically following their desire. One of them, for example, is talking about the separation of men and women. And in fact, he was talking specifically about the Maya conventions and how the Maya is run. He doesn't like the way they are run. And he's talking about the separation of men and women. And here is his statements about the separation of men and women, and his dalil of why we should not have separation between men and women. He says that we love our wives, and we don't when we want them close to us. However, the person who said this, he has written about 40 books about this, in Arabic and English. And he used to be the editor of a magazine in English. In fact, now he's a consulting advisor for another magazine. هذا دليل شرعي. We like our wives, and we like our wives. So since we like our wives, why should our wives be separate from us? As I said, I could not think of any other topic to put this under except hawa, desire. He did not bring any dalil. He did not bring anything that could make one think that this is based on some rational argument, but simply, if we like it and we don't see anything wrong with it, I assume that's what he means also, that we don't see anything wrong with it. Therefore, our wives should be close to us. There should be no separation between men and women. Also, if you read, for example, Muhammad al-Ghazali's short chapter on singing in his book on Sunnah, you get the same impression. Basically, he's saying that I listened to this song, and the song he quoted, by the way, was sung by Feroz. He doesn't mention that in the book. But he basically is saying, I listened to the song, I didn't find anything wrong with it. Why are these people so strict about, especially you're talking about people of a different country, so why are they so strict about it? I didn't see anything wrong with it. Obviously this is not any kind of dalil, and especially if there are some kind of evidence that go against what he's saying. Just to say that, well, I couldn't find anything wrong with it, so therefore we should say it is halal. This is true in some cases, but it's not true in other cases. If there's nothing in the nusus, if there's nothing in the Qur'an or Hadith that shows that there's something wrong with this, then we could say that there's nothing in the Qur'an or Sunnah that says this is wrong, and also we don't see anything wrong with it, so therefore we can accept it. But if there's something in the Qur'an or Sunnah, and the statements of the Salaf, that show that there is something wrong with it, then we cannot just say, well, I didn't see anything wrong with it, so therefore I will do it. And finally, I guess the last point that I will mention today, because I'm exhausted, I don't know about the rest of you. The last point I will mention today is in their methodology, of course, they have very little respect for the opinions of the Salaf, whether it is the Sahaba or the Tabi'een or anyone other of them. Because they say, as Abu Hanifa said about the Tabi'een, that we are نحن رجال وهم رجال, and we are men and they are men, so therefore we should be able freely to accept and reject whatever they said. Now this probably isn't true, or this certainly isn't true with respect to the Sahaba, what the Sahaba agreed upon. And also we have to compare our knowledge with their knowledge and our taqwa with their taqwa to really say if in fact we should put ourselves in the same position as the Salaf. Especially since the Prophet ﷺ said that the best generation is his generation, and then the one after, and then the one after. And this means that we should have some respect for that generation, and not just, especially again, as I said, the generation of the Sahaba, who were brought up by the Prophet ﷺ under his guidance, and who lived the Qur'an, and who saw the Qur'an being revealed in front of them. And we cannot deal with their opinions as if they are anyone just like anyone else. If we know their position with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them, and so therefore we should respect their position and not deal with them just like they are some ignorant Bedouins from a time before, which is what how one of the ones who wrote in Manar magazine earlier this century. He described them as basically Bedouins who had no culture and no knowledge. And this kind of approach to the Salaf, it is very dangerous, and I would expect, especially from people who consider themselves people of Dawah and so forth, that they would have a better understanding of Islam than that. No questions or comments? Inshallah, I'd like to welcome back Brother Khalid, who had an operation, as you probably all can see, even if it's on the table. I may take back that welcome depending on the question that he has. I think, Khalid, you said you had a question? Oh, anyway.
I'd like to know what do you think of the argument of some Muslims who are directing the state that need mistakes, riba.
Yeah.
What do you think of this argument?
The question is what?
Living for living in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. The question is that what do you think of the argument that need, you mean Barura or you mean by need, it is a situation of Barura? Yeah. So in other words, the case of necessity today that we need to take part in riba systems, I guess. Well, I discussed riba last time. Well, probably the best answer for that question, especially with respect to the less developed countries, is that riba is the thing that requires riba. And the reason that they are in so much debt actually is because of the riba that they agreed to pay. And most of their payments that they made is just payments on the interest, and it is not payments on the actual principal that they borrow. And we are living in a difficult situation, but probably as a nation as a whole, if you study really the concept of riba, and if you study the power that these nations would have if they really try to flex their power in the face of the kuffar, in the face of the IMF, in the face of the World Bank and so forth, there actually no need to actually take riba. But most likely it is something, as in many cases, the people who agree to this riba, they are getting kickbacks themselves, they are getting benefits themselves, while in fact it is harming the country rather than benefiting the country. Wow.
الأسبوع الماضي سمعت من الآن مصير للنساء عندها محاضرة، وكان عنوان المحاضرة عن الطهارة، فكان من دعوتها للنساء كتحفيز النساء حضور المحاضرة، كانت تقول لهم أن عنوان المحاضرة حيكون حول خلاف الشارع عن العلم بالطهارة. بمعنى آخر المحاضرة كانت عن الاستحاضة، والاستحاضة يعني رأي الشعب فيها إنه لا يجوز للرجل يجامع أو يجوز للرجل يجامع المرأة في ترى العدل، العلم يرى العدل، فكان هذا عنوان المحاضرة. وما أدري أنا ثاني شوي عنوان المحاضرة أو خاصة إني سامع رأي الزلزال في الموضوع هذا، إنه من الغريب أو لا يمكن للعلم إذا ثبت إنه حقيقة علمية أن تختلف مع الشارع. قد يكون الاختلاف ناتج من عدم قدرتنا على تفسير الآية أو الحديث. في الحالة هذه يمكن يكون الشارع هو الصح، ولكن ما إذا كانت حقيقة علمية ثابتة 100% فلا بد أن يكون مثل نص القرآن أو الحديث مطابق.
Yes. And the question was referring to a lecture that was given to the women. Basically, the question is about an example of mustahada, the woman who has a prolonged flow of blood, that the Sharia says that it is permissible for the man or the husband to have intercourse with his wife when she's in that state. Science seems to show that this would be harmful to her. Is that what you're saying? So is there a contradiction here between science and what the Sharia is saying and so forth? And with respect to science stating that intercourse with a woman who has mustahada is harmful to her, I have read some things on this topic and I haven't come across that. You're saying this is what Zindani said? Or you just that's the principle?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the first question is whether or not that's true. From what I have read, I haven't seen that to be the case. The second point is that the Sharia itself, the Sharia meaning the Qur'an and Sunnah, does not explicitly state that it is permissible for a man to have intercourse with a woman who has mustahada. This is the opinion of the fuqaha, and there is a difference of opinion about it. Some fuqaha say it is allowed, some fuqaha say it is not allowed. Some fuqaha say if this is her situation for a long period of time, then it will be kind of hardship upon the man, and therefore it is allowed for him. In other words, the maslahah of the man in that case will take precedence over the harm that may come to the woman. So you're not talking about a case where the nusus or the text of the Qur'an and Hadith actually says something. This is again something that the fuqaha discussed, but you will not find an explicit hadith about it. But as far as I know, from what I have seen in reading about mustahada, there is no proof that a woman in that situation is harmed by having intercourse with her during that time.
وهذا الشيء ناوي أنا متأكد إنه لو كان فيه أذى لابد يكون فيه ما إذا كان ثابت أنه لابد يكون فيه ما يؤيد القرآن وليس ما يخالفه. ولكن أنا اللي أثارني إنه يعني مع احترامي للكل لأن قد تكون زوجة أحد إخواني، اللي أثارني طريقة يعني الترويج يعني تسويق إلى الترويج للدعوة كأنه في بديهية أنه كثير خلاف.
نعم. هذا بس هو كان التدليس يعني في رأسنا. وهو ما تكتب لهم الحديث أن تتحدثنا وسمعنا. It's clear, يعني the title that she gave the lecture, that title she gave the lecture is not correct. Which title? The question is if I believe in the term Asrani movement, if it is really a movement, it should have leadership. So therefore, who are the leaders? First of all, not every movement has to have leaders as such. There are some movements that kind of occur almost by osmosis. If you look, for example, at the French Revolution, and before the French Revolution, things were happening. There was no, and you have a few people who were speaking, but there was no real leader of the movement. This is our movement, and this is what we're asking for. But things happen because of the events that occurred. So when we talk about the Asraniya movement, similarly, we're not talking about one movement with one leader and such, but we're talking about a group of scholars who have this way of thinking, who are influencing others. In other words, they each have their followers, and they each have their people that they are influencing. Well, in the second lecture, I explicitly mentioned some of the leaders of this movement, or some of the people who have this approach to Islam, and they are influencing others, such as Fatih Uthman in the United States, and Hassan Turabi and Muhammad al-Ghazali. We mentioned them in that lecture. But we're not talking about one movement saying that, this is for example, Fatih Rahman, he called himself a modernist, and he said this is what Islam means. But at the same time, you cannot say that since he called himself a modernist, he was the leader of the movement. In fact, Fatih Rahman has much less followers than these other people that I mentioned.
You said that democracy is no place in Islam. And there are certain Islamic countries which proclaim themselves as Islamic democratic republics. So how far do you see this Islamic democratic term? We say that people would vote, but the government would try to implement Sharia and Islamic concepts in their everyday life.
No. The question was that I said that democracy has no place in Islam, and so therefore what can we say about these governments that call themselves the Islamic Democratic Republic? Well, I think what I said basically is that to use the term democracy, you have to define exactly what you mean by that term. So if you mean by the term democracy what the West means by that, as I mentioned, this is actually a type of kufr. If you use the term democracy, and perhaps it's not good to use the term, you should use a different term. But if you use the term democracy and you define it in such a way that is consistent with Islam, then there's nothing wrong with that. Although still I think it would be best not to use that term. Because as I said, democracy has a certain meaning to people, has a certain history, it has its own principles, and these principles are not consistent with Islam. So therefore it would be best not to use the term democracy. But if a government should call themselves a democratic government and they define democracy in such a way that it is consistent with Islam, then there's nothing wrong with it.
But the way they're conducting this election and the way they're conducting this government, that's the response to democracy in the West. But then the government says that we will implement Sharia and Islamic law. So,
in other words, they're saying that the people are not the lawgivers, but the people simply elect representatives to be the leaders of the people in implementing the Sharia. So this is a basic difference from democracy, in that, for example, the United States, they call it democracy, but actually it's not a democracy, it's a republic, to be specific. But if, for example, the government of the Congress of the United States wanted to change the Constitution, wanted even to get rid of the Constitution, they would have that right. While in Islam, the appointed or the elected officials, they would not have the right, of course, to do away with the Qur'an or to do away with the laws of Islam. So that is a basic difference between the two. With respect to how to choose the Khalifa, or how to choose even who should be the members of Ahl Shura, and Islam has left that quite open. Hasn't really restricted it to one or two ways, but in general has left it open, such that many scholars are of the opinion that, and this is, I'm not talking about recent scholars, I'm talking about scholars from quite some time ago who were influenced by some of the Greek writings, or not influenced, but who were familiar with some of the Greek writings. So if people, for example, voted and chose an Amir, and he threw a vote and he just took the majority, they said this is not the best way to choose the Khalifa. And this is not the best way, because this is not the way of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it's not the way of Abu Bakr and so forth. But they said that this is perhaps the permissible way. This is not the best way. So if these people, again, are defining democracy in such a way that just people are going to be elected to lead the others, and they are elected to implement the Sharia, not to make it a Sharia, but to implement it. And Allah Alam, this might be an acceptable form of government. And Allah Alam, this is something that the scholars today, in my opinion, have not really discussed to the extent that I think they should.
لازم elaborate on your point on العلم. I think العلم عندها تأثير على الأرواح. And people that say that it doesn't exist because we don't feel it, الهواء we don't feel it, and we can breathe it. Okay? في أشعة استعملها لنا في الشمس مرتبطة بعينك لما تشوفها تعمى. ما تحس فيها بعد يوم ليومين حتعمى لما تحس فيها فيها تأثير العين في النوم تنين لطيفة. هذا حاجات happens and to elaborate that العين هذه very تأثير on أرواح البني آدم. وحاجة قليلة هو إنه البني آدم يبدأ بالنظر يمكن أصلاً تستريح له باله ولا من ضمن ماشية يتوقع الروح دياله لأن العين لما تكتشف الروح الله أعلم.
Would you like to translate? No, go ahead.
I was just talking about the evil eye. There's a good relation between the human soul and the eye. For instance, and the human being can involve the landscape. And as soon as you look at the landscape, your heart opens up. Or if you could see something, if you probably see something big that you can get frightened to the point of recalling or reacting to it. And there are a lot of things, like I work with some radiation, but I can work in the lab. You could walk into a cinema and you won't see anything. You put your hands in, if you put your eye, you would break the veil over the next day you find it. And you wouldn't have felt anything. So there are things that you can feel and happen. And what someone was talking about these movements, they deny the existence of the evil eye. You know, any holy truth to the point. We just go, we can't see it, we can't see it, we can't not exist. And we can see it, we'll let that go.
This is for the tape. Basically, the brother was mentioning, as I think we mentioned in the last lecture, that this view of the Islamiyya movement, that basically what we cannot see or what we cannot feel and so forth is to be basically rejected. With respect to Al-Ain, as I mentioned in this lecture, he mentioned some examples of how the eye has some, the eye itself, there's some relation between it and the soul, and things can happen that we cannot really see at the present time, but it will have an effect.
I have one question, collaboration on, we define, or you define the Afghanian movement as almost some leaders. In my opinion, this leader, especially joining the United States, you mentioned Pastor Qur'an, I don't know any. But he's trying here in the United States, I think, to bring some of the Christian people into Islam. So he has to do these kinds of movements to show them at the beginning, because at the beginning when you bring someone to Islam, you don't have to give him all the restrictions, which is going to be a Muslim, you don't have to do this and this and this and this and this. So at the beginning you have to start very light with him. And then when he became a Muslim, strongly can go further. So he said, what you are saying is true. And he said with the Qur'an and with the Sharia and with everything, with the Hadith and all this, that you cannot bring any American has another religion to Islam. But these people, since they start to modernize, but they are still stick to Qur'an and Sharia. So maybe they can get more of the Americans or other people, they have another religion into Islam. And this is their way. And then, because when you talk to us, or when you talk to the people, they have a strong religion, so it's okay. We know what is the difference between this and this. But when you start to talk to the people, you just start it, or you try to get them into Islam, they cannot say everything like, I'm going to bring usually the Zarabozo. They try to get the Americans by choice, they try to bring them to the mosque. Listen to lectures, okay? But at the beginning, don't tell them, no, don't do so and so. But
I mean, it has to come gradually. So this is my idea of the people, especially if they live in a country which is not an Islamic country. So they have to go gradually, and then the one who became a Muslim, by himself he starts reading and he starts asking about the question, and he starts to gain more information and more good things about Islam and Sharia and all this stuff. But if he starts very hard, we'll never get anyone of the people, because they have a lot of freedom with these things. If you go to another religion, even when you go to the Christianity, you don't go to the church, because they see that the church will put a lot of restriction on them, so they don't go to the church. So I think, in my opinion, this is one way for these people to live in Venice. They want to practice them by trying to make Islam the modern and all these conditions. And when you practice them, when you become a Muslim, you can say, tell them all the other restrictions of Islam. That's my thing. If you have any comments.
Oh, sure, I do. Repeat what he said. With an Egyptian accent and everything else. I think basically the brother was saying that in our situation here in the United States, and if these people are calling new people to Islam, and so therefore their approach is not to give them everything of Islam at one time, but to try to give them something that will make them appreciate Islam, and so therefore inshallah they will enter Islam, and then after they enter Islam, inshallah they will become real Muslims. First of all, as I mentioned about the Mu'tazila, it's Allah Alam, it seemed clear from some of the writings of the Mu'tazila that they were trying to defend Islam from the influence, or from being considered weak in the face of Greek philosophy. So therefore they tried to interpret in Islam in such a way to show that it is consistent with Greek philosophy. And the point I made at that time is that the niyyah, or the intention of the person, is not sufficient. He must make sure that what he's doing and what he's saying is also correct. And even if he has a right niyyah, if what he's doing is going against the Qur'an or Sunnah, this is still incorrect. So the niyyah of this modernist movement is to bring non-Muslims to Islam, even if that's their intention. The way that they're doing it is not correct, because the way that they're doing it is not the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Secondly, Islam, as we know, is Deen al-Fitra, and that the basic teachings and the aqidah of Islam is something acceptable to all human beings, and there's no reason for us to try to distort it and so forth. And some of the points that they talk about are not related to practices, like whether you should wear hijab or not cream and so forth, but actually are related to the aqidah about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the aqidah about the Qur'an, about whether or not we have to apply the Qur'an today exactly as it is, or so forth. Thirdly, especially with respect to Fatih Rahman, and also with respect to Muhammad al-Ghazali, Fatih Rahman's writings are mostly towards Muslims. He is trying to show Muslims what is the true Islam. He is not writing towards non-Muslims. He is writing towards Muslims. Or Muhammad al-Ghazali, obviously, he is writing towards Muslims also. Well, I know of many women, or at least a few women, who stopped wearing hijab because of the influence of Fatih Rahman. So if it were the case that they are writing, trying to influence non-Muslims, although that wouldn't be correct, at least we can say that that's better. But in fact, they are writing towards Muslims, and they're claiming that what they're saying is the true Islam, and we have to leave the old culture of Islam, or whatever they want to call it, behind. Sure.
Your point, I don't agree with. One point is that you told you like me and teaching about Islam.
Saying anything against the Quran today. Verse 15. الفكر الإسلامي والتطور. This is one of the Jewish books in Arabic.
As I said, I don't know him, but if he knows a lot of books in English, this means that he's trying to attract the non-Arabic.
As I said, his books in English, they are written towards Muslims, they're not written towards non-Muslims. And he's trying to show the mistake of Islam, of the Muslims, what is Sunni Islam, and show what is the correct Islam.
If he wrote them in English, so that non-Arabic people read it.
But they're Muslims. For example, I write in English, all my writing is towards Muslims. I'm not writing towards non-Muslims. So also Fatih Rahman, when you read his book, it's very clear that he's writing to Muslims. He's using terms and references that only Muslims could understand. But to emphasize the point that Brother Adil made, that if you tell him something and not true at the beginning and then finally he finds out that what you said actually wasn't true, and there will be a big letdown. One thing related to this is the question of whether Isa alayhi salam had a father or not. Okay? Some of the modernists said he had a father. Well, there was one brother in David, and he was with us for about 3 years in David. And one day we were discussing it, and we pointed out, of course, that Isa didn't have a father and so forth. I don't know. It was in a Quranic meeting or something. And his father got very upset. And he said, I was tricked into becoming a Muslim. Because I was told in Islam you believe that Isa had a father.
Okay, but this is again...
Okay. Well, again, as I said, many of the things they said are against the Quran and Sunnah when they make these kinds of... This is the kind of surreal. If you say there's no such thing as jinn, are you going against the Quran and Sunnah? If you say there's no such thing as al-ayn, are you going against the Quran and Sunnah? So this brother, after that time, he stopped coming to the mosque. He said, I was tricked into becoming a Muslim. I don't believe Jesus doesn't have a father, and he left. And also with respect to the practices, and if you teach Islam properly, as I mentioned on many occasions before, the way of da'wah usually in this country is incorrect. The way of da'wah, what da'wah is all about is to teach people La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And to show them the truth of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. If they believe that, and you are able to show them the truth of that, and they believe in it, then the practices will follow. Okay? But if you come to them saying that Islam is purely rational, we have the best economic system, we treat women this way, and such, you never actually give them Islam. And they will enter Islam because they like the way Muslims treat women, or they like the political system of Islam, but when it comes to La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, they will never understand it. And if it comes to the point finally that they have to accept what Allah said, they might reject it. So in fact, this is not da'wah at all to Islam, this kind of thing. I'm not sure I understood exactly what the question was. Not to be cool. And advice to whom?
To Muslim youth. Sometimes
Muslim youth, to make them...
Sometimes when they argue, they use
the Muslim youth themselves use these arguments and so forth. And I have to be frank, I'm not sure how to respond to that question. This is a difficult question because you're talking about the people themselves who are using the verb. So if they're all using it, and it means that they have... You're not talking about, for example, how to answer them or how the others should be aware of it.
I'm talking about ordinary people.
Who are using those arguments.
Who are using some arguments, and if you look at the arguments themselves, you find inside this argument some of the methodology or the opinion about one.
So, you're talking about those people themselves who are using this argument. How to advise them? That's a good question. And the way to advise them, so we're actually talking about someone who's doing something wrong and he knows it's wrong.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't know something. So the way to advise them, I guess, would be to give him the importance of speaking, the danger of speaking without ilm, and the importance of making sure that what he is saying is correct by comparing it to the Qur'an and Sunnah, by comparing it to those scholars well known in Islam who do not have, are known and not for having strange opinions. And to be careful when he speaks, not to give an opinion about something related to Islam that he actually hasn't researched in detail. Just reading one book and saying this is Islam's opinion about something, this is very dangerous. I don't know what to say.
جزاك الله خير. بارك الله فيك. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك.